Hello and welcome to the Muscle Engineer podcast. I am your host Sotak Andrei, and this is episode 9 of the podcast, in which I'm about to be joined by Dr. Brandon Roberts to discuss some concepts related to periodization and various methods of implementing it for bodybuilding. Brandon has a PhD in muscle biology and is currently a postdoctoral fellow with research interests that include the molecular pathways that are involved in muscle regeneration and resistance exercise adaptations. Aside from being a peer-reviewed researcher, he has written articles for Stronger by Science, which is Greg Nuckols' website, and Aragon's research review, to name few of the many. In addition to his academic pedigree, Brandon also works as the Director of Research and Education and as an online coach for The Strength Guys, a very well-known and respected online powerlifting and bodybuilding coaching company, and also competes himself as a natural bodybuilder. I initially wanted this episode to be more of a theoretical one, where we dive deep into the theoretical concepts and methods behind periodization for bodybuilding, but it turned out to be a much more practical one, and I don't mind that, and I don't think you will mind it either. During our conversation, we define a couple of fundamental concepts related to periodization, and we discuss the history and development of it, but we also give a ton of practical insights when it comes to taking periodization, implementing it into your own bodybuilding routine. And I also brought up the seeming contradiction between the recent method of increasing number of sets during an accumulation phase, as popularized by Dr. Mike Israetel, as opposed to a more traditional method, such as the one that Brandon usually uses and the one, for example, someone like Eric Helms would use. And I also give my own contributions in the form of a couple of my top tips when it comes to maximizing arm growth while keeping your elbows healthy. So there are a ton of practical insights and takeaways you can just take from this episode and implement right into your training. And I hope you will enjoy this and you will find it useful. Also, make sure to stick around until the end if you're interested in some of my own conclusions and thoughts around this whole topic of periodization and what I think would be the most useful and most relevant way to look at periodization and how you should implement it into your own training. So without further ado, here's episode 9 of the Muscle Engineer podcast with Dr. Brandon Roberts. Brandon Roberts, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. I'm glad we were able to schedule this. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I just gave a couple lectures on periodization, so it's good timing. Reviewed the literature and such, so I think I've got some good stuff for you.
Awesome. So before we get into periodization itself, what got you interested in the whole topic of it, and how did you end up teaching a course on it at the university you work at?
So we have a kinesiology department, and I didn't teach a whole course per se, but I had 2 or 3 guest lectures, and the course instructors, just a simile of professors, are like, "Oh, what are you interested in?" And I was like, "Oh, periodization. I've heard a lot about it, but and I started teaching this course last year, but I don't know the underpinning of it. I don't know the history. It's kind of like briefly covered in textbooks, and unless you really dig into it, it's hard to tell what's going on, and then even more so what's like true and not true, and what's kind of like dogma versus applicable."
Awesome. And I guess your roles as a coach and your interest as a bodybuilder yourself have definitely played into this, and it was useful for those avenues too.
Yeah, for sure. I use a couple different formats for me, and then athletes just kind of vary depending on their goals and stuff. So knowing, I guess, the science behind all of them and when and where to use them is pretty cool too. And I had a short stint in strength and conditioning, where in sport it's much different than physique or powerlifting too. So we'll cover that, a little bit of that.
Sure. So I always like to start with the beginning, and I like to define things for everyone just so we know exactly what we're talking about and everyone is on the same playing field. So what exactly is periodization and how was it developed?
Okay, so periodization, it doesn't have a kind of formal definition. If you look through papers and textbooks, everybody kind of has a spin on what it means, but I'll give you a simple one. It's the planned distribution of training load and kind of content or how you're training in a periodic basis. So a certain period, say a year, a month, a week, whatever. So that's kind of the basics of it. Now, we'll get into some more detailed definitions a little bit later because it's kind of molded over the course of the past 50 years. But originally, it was developed by a Russian kind of physiologist named Leo Medvedev. And that was back, in the 50s in Russia in the Olympics. And Russia did really well in the Olympics for that time period. And they also had this kind of affinity for structure. So they really liked planning. So when he kind of developed this periodization, everybody else kind of saw that they were winning. They were like, oh, well, this must be some secret like coaching tool that we're not using. So that was kind of the basis of it. And then people started adapting it. The different countries kind of either supported it or said, no, this is not really like an applicable tool. And it was all based around the general adaptation syndrome, which is kind of this stress. So you have an alarm phase where you dip after a stress. You have a resistance phase where you kind of adapt. And then if you are kind of constantly bombarded with this stress, you have an exhaustion phase. So that's the GAS, which is, if you look at the textbooks, it's pretty much the theory underpinning periodization.
Awesome. And that should give people a brief outline because, yeah, definitely periodization has often you see people bring it up and like you said, how do you define it exactly definitely varies. And I'm in a good relationship with Mike Israetel, and he did his PhD under Professor Mike Stone, and he was a key figure in the development of the theory behind periodization.
Oh, yeah. The kind of when I started writing my articles on it, that was the starting point. Mike Stone did a paper in 1982 that just really laid it out well. And then it proceeded to grow. I think there's probably 40 to 50 studies using periodization now. So it's definitely a good place to do your PhD on it with him.
Yeah. So there are a couple of key concepts that are usually thrown around and come up when people discuss periodization. Things like mesocycle or a microcycle, or even things like specificity or overload, and even something like fatigue or fitness, all of these, or even the general adaptation syndrome you mentioned. Could you just maybe, I know the question was a bit vague, but just define all of these briefly so everyone can understand what it exactly is, for example, microcycle?
Yeah, for sure. So if we think from biggest to smallest, we'll start out with a macrocycle. Most people consider that a year. Sometimes it can be shorter, sometimes it could be longer, but the traditional macrocycle is like a year. A mesocycle is like a step down from that. So you're looking at 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the coach and the circumstances. But it's basically a smaller block of the macrocycle. And then even smaller than that, you have the microcycle, which are generally a week in time period. So you'll have 4 to 6 microcycles in one mesocycle, and then, maybe 12 mesocycles in a macrocycle. So that's kind of how I explain it in general. You had one other question there. What was the other concept you wanted me to touch on?
Just some essential concepts related to programming itself. So things like specificity or overload, or even fatigue or fatigue management.
Yeah. Okay. So other than the general adaptation syndrome, there's another model, kind of a theory, if you will, called the fitness fatigue model. And this is the idea that as you accumulate fitness or adapt to whatever training you're doing, you also accumulate fatigue. So, and if you Google it, there's some pretty simple images where these two lines come together, right? So to show your fitness, you have to dissipate the fatigue. And this is where different cycles come in, where maybe in the beginning of your macrocycle, you do a lot of high volume stuff. And then over time, you transition to lower volume, but you're creeping up that intensity and the specificity over time to hit your event. So if it's a powerlifting event, maybe 12 to 16 weeks out, you're doing more volume and you're letting that kind of glide down. And then as we get closer to the competition, we're focusing on just the competition lifts, at a high intensity, and the frequency usually changes a little bit too. So I think that's the basics.
Yeah, and those concepts can definitely be integrated in a properly periodized plan, and I'm sure a bit later can we touch on how they exactly would be connected in order to set up a plan that makes most sense. But before we go into that, I think it would be useful to address the different kinds and types of periodization that people would use or at least hear about. Usually there are three big, I don't know if it's fair to call them categories. So usually there is a linear periodization model, a block periodization model, and then there is some sort of an undulated periodization model. And of course these need not be mutually exclusive, but many people view them as such. So could you please address maybe one at a time? What are the key characteristics of them?
Okay, yeah, of course. So you're right. These are the basic three, we'll call them concepts, if you will. We have linear, where you'll start out at maybe a higher rep range. Maybe you do 3 sets of 12. Then the next week you do 3 sets of 8. And the next week you do 3 sets of 4, where you're going kind of up in intensity but down in overall reps. So that would be linear. And you can stretch that over all kinds of different time periods. Block would be something that's used a lot more in strength and conditioning. And that's maybe a mesocycle, so 4 to 6 weeks, where you focus on one type of adaptation. And maybe it's power, right? So you're hitting those low reps, maybe 1 to 3 reps in all of your training. And then so after you do maybe power for a block, you would switch and do strength for a block or hypertrophy for a block. And kind of those traditional rep and set schemes would fit into that block concept. And then undulated periodization, there's 2 types. There's daily undulated, where you go, maybe Monday you do sets of 12, Wednesday you do sets of 3, and then Friday you're back up to like 6 or something. So it's not really linear or block, right? But you're doing different types of reps or schemes each workout. And then weekly is just maybe where you say, unlike linear, you don't go from high to low. You say, all right, we're going to do 12, and then we're going to do 6s, and then we're going to do 8s, and then we're going to do 10s, and then we're going to do 4s, right? So that's kind of the weekly aspect of it. But those are the main 3 concepts.
Yeah, thanks for that. Another concept that is becoming more popular these days, I think, is modern or integrated periodization. Essentially taking all these concepts and integrating all of them into one structured, well thought out plan instead of viewing them as mutually exclusive or looking at one or the other and something that cannot be merged together. So how could all of these 3 components be integrated in training week and then maybe a training month?
So I actually use more of an integrated approach with all of my athletes and myself, especially powerlifters, because depending on your goal, so we'll just use powerlifting for an example, we might think that maybe undulating is a little bit better, or maybe people just prefer a certain type of method. I really like linear periodization. It's very kind of linear, obviously, but I just like the form of it. Every week I go in and I do a little bit more weight, a little bit fewer reps. So for my big 3, so my bench, deadlift, and squat, I'll use a linear approach. And then underneath that, so maybe for my accessory work or my volume work, basically for my bodybuilding stuff, I'll say, all right, well, we kind of know that you can do pretty much any rep range and you'll hypertrophy. Some rep ranges are just easier to accumulate volume in. That's why we have that 8 to 12, and that's the classic hypertrophy range. So I'll say this month I'm going to do my accessory work in that 8 to 12 range while my big 3 go linear. And then maybe even if I want to throw something else in, I could have kind of blocks of more accessories, maybe like arms or something, something smaller that I'm not as concerned with, that are always at a very high rep range, maybe just because I like it better. So that's how you can kind of interplay them. It's hard to explain. When I teach these classes, I have a whiteboard and I'll kind of draw everything out and go through it and point it out. And it makes a little bit better sense, but if you use your little bit of imagination, I think you can see how it would work into one training program.
Yeah, sure. So if you take training weeks, let's say you do the same body part twice a week, and even if you do Monday, you use 6 to 8 rep range, something like that, and Thursday you use the 10 to 15 rep range. That's already undulated. And then if you also increase the weights week by week, then you also have a linear component to it. So you already integrated two periodization models in that. When you said that you follow a linear periodization model for your main lifts, is this for hypertrophy training, for muscle growth outcome, or simply to get stronger in general?
I like to use my big three because I'm not personally not like a power lifter. I'm not even super strong or anything. So it's always bodybuilding based work, and there's no kind of evidence that one periodization scheme works better. There's actually a meta-analysis, I think this year, came out on hypertrophy and periodization, and it basically says, there's no real evidence to say we should be doing a certain type. So I like to do it for strength, and what I do is over 6 weeks, we'll say, I'll go linear, and I'll try to, across each mesocycle, increase my weight, but within each mesocycle, I am doing linear, so each week I'm doing more weight and less reps. So it's a way to kind of compare. I think on Facebook I posted a comparison of one of my athletes who I use linear with, and you can see just the slight volume uptick each mesocycle is what you're kind of going for.
Yeah, so if you look at January, February, the trend is upward, but if you look at the week 1 to 4 in January, for example, then the trend is downward for the volume. Before we go back into some more practical stuff, I'm glad you've mentioned that there isn't a whole lot of data around periodization for bodybuilding, because many people seem to think that, or they almost portray it as if there were a solid 50 studies showing that this particular periodization model is better. But before we go and look into a particular model itself, just periodization in general, what does the science say about it for bodybuilding outcomes? And by that I mean, how big of an impact is it going to have? And I know you can't give a solid answer, but just as a theoretical figure, because if you think about it, any variation you do in your training could be considered periodization, even if that person isn't aware of it. So I imagine that would be hard to set up a training study with periodized and non-periodized training, because then even if you include something like an easy week in the middle of a 12-week study, then that could be considered a periodized plan. So it would be hard to set it up.
Yeah, definitely. So, and there's not, I want to say Schoenfeld is working on a meta or a systematic review or something right now, because the one I saw, it was trying to compare hypertrophy across different periodization styles. And, there are a lot of studies, but there's not many studies that measure hypertrophy in a good manner, right? So if you have all these studies, say we have 20 studies, and 5 are using like skin folds, 5 are using ultrasound, 5 are using DEXA, and then another 5 are using biopsies. So they're looking like at the muscle. It's really hard to compare without a constant outcome measure. So what it was in Peer J, which is the journal, and it basically, said there's no difference. But my interpretation was that they just don't have enough outcomes to even say if there would be a difference. It's just so kind of like underpowered that maybe there's a 2% difference, but ultimately we don't know. Now, like you said, pretty much everyone, even if they don't mean to, are kind of periodizing their workouts. For example, in the old school, they would go in and they would believe the idea of muscle confusion, right? So they would do, sets of 8 or sets of 6 or something. And then when they got tired of that, they'd go in and do sets of 12. Well, that's kind of periodizing your workouts.
Yeah, that's weekly.
Yeah. And then most college age students, right? And this is when I first started personal training. That's kind of the demographic I was training, was professors and college age males and females. Well, they have this thing called winter break, right? So you would work really hard with them for 12 to 14 weeks, and then they would have 2 weeks off. So that's another type of form of periodization, really, if you think about it, because of daily activities, daily life, traveling, everything kind of comes into play here when we're talking about manipulating training variables. So yeah, I think you're right that it's been around for a while. It's just what people call it and how people think about it is different depending on who you are.
Yeah, because I even got into arguments at the gym over this, and not even periodization itself, but simply tracking my workouts. Like someone saw me ticking the boxes in my phone or something and asked me what I'm doing. I told them, well, I'm tracking my workouts, and he replied, well, I haven't seen any IFBB pro inputting his sets in his phone. And that's such a weak argument on so many levels. But
if you look at the elite natural bodybuilders, they definitely track their workouts. Maybe not like all of them all the time, but they're trying to progress, the loads and push the weights and things like that. It's pretty normal. So
that's what I told him, that the best naturalists are doing just that. And honestly, I'm not really interested in what Phil Heath is doing, because I'm not Phil Heath and you're not either. So frankly, it's not really relevant. And some of the smartest guys I know, like I don't know if you're familiar with any of them, but guys like Scott Stevenson or Jordan Peters or even the whole DC crew, the Dante Trudel, and pretty much most sane and well put together bodybuilding programs have some sort of a tracking or logbooking element incorporated into it, and they have some sort of a progression underpinning. So most reasonable programs won't just make you go into the gym and just lift whatever until you can't lift anymore, and then go home and then repeat the process again. One of the things that's been on my mind for a long time is this, I don't know if it's a conflict, but this seeming conflict when it comes to periodization for bodybuilding itself. Mike Israetel has popularized this approach of what he calls, he first popularized the MRV concept and recently came out with the Volume Landmarks book. And he has outlined this, I think, in many places now, that he likes to start at what he calls the minimum effective volume and then go up microcycle by microcycle throughout the mesocycle to the maximum recoverable volume and kind of deload and repeat. So essentially what he does is, let's say you start at 10 sets and then you go up to 18 sets, increasing the number of sets you do for a given muscle group by 2 each week. And then you also try to increase the weights, while at least that's what I do. I try to stay in a certain rep range. So it has some linear elements and definitely has undulation components, because I don't do the same rep ranges all over and over again. But I'm not decreasing volume microcycle by microcycle, as opposed to someone like yourself, from what I understood, and I've seen Eric Helms do the same or make the same recommendations in his pyramid book. So what do you think about these two seemingly opposite approaches? Although I guess if you look at them more outside perspective, they are not that opposite, but still.
Yeah. So I think that I like the way Mike has explained the volume approaches. I've not read all of the books, but I've read quite a bit of his work. And this idea of kind of volume benchmarks, it's been around since the 70s or 80s, just not like formally given a name. So it's really good to simplify it for the general population, the fitness population, to say, oh, here's what you want to aim for, and here's how you can get there. So I really like that approach. The thing that I kind of, I guess, if you're gonna put Dr. Helms and I kind of the same side, if you will, I think it's a little bit more conservative compared to what Mike likes to do, because if you're working with someone for a really long time, and they buy in, right? And they say, I understand that muscle grows really slow. We actually don't even know how fast muscle grows, but I'm okay not getting injured and slowly deloading every 4 to 5 to 6 weeks, rather than pushing, adding 2 sets a week or however you want to do it. And then kind of once I hit the maximum recoverable volume, we kind of deload or whatnot. So I think that's the main difference, is just being more aggressive versus being more conservative. And honestly, it probably has to do more with personalities than anything else in coaching. But yeah, I like both of them. I think if you're an athlete, right, if you want to be an elite athlete, the more aggressive approach, and they talked about this in their roundtable on Jeff Nippard's podcast, it may be better, right? Because if you want to be the best, you want to get there quickly, and you don't really care how long you stay there, because if you're young enough, and if you're in your prime, you'll be there for long enough to keep yourself happy. Now, if you get an injury going up quickly, that's when we have issues. But, elite athletes are kind of hard to injure anyway. They're very resilient. So I think that's the main difference. I don't think either approach is like better. It's just different kind of concepts.
Yeah, well, I always try to keep the context and the perspective in place. So again, that's why I try to clarify that it's not that big of a conflict as some people like to make. Oh, let's see, prepare the popcorn. I highly respect both of them, and both of them are trying to figure out what works the best for them and for the clients they work with, and that's what I try to do as well. So if we take the bigger picture approach, both of them are still doing enough volume and using heavier weights over time and focusing on proper execution. So that's great, and that's the foundation.
Right. And it would be, so this is kind of a sidebar, but it would be really interesting to see if certain types of kind of client athletes prefer like one method over another. So maybe it's just that Mike gets some really like aggressive type people who just love to push, whereas, Eric doesn't get that as much. And that could be, a factor too. The population plays a big role in it. So I don't know.
Oh yeah, but I still find it funny that they consider him the conservative guy or the the moderate guy when he coaches Bryce Lewis.
That is true. Bryce does some pretty crazy weights. So
yeah, it's just, I don't know. I mean, for myself, I just don't see much sense to if you keep the rep ranges pretty narrow, then it's fine to go from 12 to 10 to 8, I guess. But if you're going to view volume as the main driver, as long as you don't do anything stupid with the rep ranges, as long as you don't start comparing doubles with sets of 50 or something, as long as you are in that 8 to 12, 6 to 15, something like that. If you consider volume the main driver, then it would make sense to keep in a moderate rep range and try to increase that. And I think what Mike does is especially valuable for once you get to that point and you try to bring up a particular body part. So if you have a body part that you want to grow specifically, then I think that's fine to keep the rest of the body parts at a more moderate volume, maybe something like 8-10 sets, something like that per week, and then push on maybe a body part or two per week and increase the volume for those to 1 or 2 muscle groups. What do you think about that approach? Or how would you set up a specialization phase essentially for a bodybuilder?
I'm doing this with 2 athletes now, and I did it with myself back after I competed because there are just sometimes areas that don't want to grow. Maybe it's genetics or whatnot. But to give you an example, I have an athlete who wanted to develop his back and his kind of shoulders a little bit more. And, you get feedback from judges when you step off stage. If they're good, they'll say, oh, if you work on this, you come back, you'll do a little better. Overall, you will obviously want to grow your whole body. But maybe when you first started training, you just only did chest and no legs or something. Not that abnormal. And so your chest is a little bit bigger. And for working on back, I would say, all right, we're going to take maybe 2 to 3 sets off of your chest work because we can maintain your hypertrophy with much less volume than it takes to increase it. And we're going to take those 2 or 3 sets and we're going to put them on some vertical or horizontal rows because you have, and I've not really found a good way to describe this, but you have a kind of a reservoir of energy such that you can hit fatigue pretty easily if you just add volume everywhere, right? And so specialization cycles allow you to kind of shift volume around just a little bit so that you can still recover as the same that you would if you're doing everything evenly, but now you can focus on maybe a back or a shoulders or an arms type movement. So I think a lot of people do that. That's not too kind of odd. But I don't do it for very long. So I'll only do it for probably maybe 3 mesocycles max. So 12 weeks, 12 to 14 weeks. I think that's enough to kind of make it up because you don't want to create a different imbalance while you're doing it too. You don't be like, oh, well, we inadvertently hypertrophied something a little bit more than we wanted to. Those are my kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, and again, that's very similar to what I've heard Mike describe in specific conversation that he does this very similar. I think, he had a recent video on Omar Isaf's channel when he discussed this exact topic, bringing up a particular lagging body parts, and this was the idea. You take a body part or two, you kind of hammer those for mesocycle or two, then maybe do a mesocycle or two of evenly distributed volume, or simply you can just shift your attention to other body parts and bring up those a bit more and keep repeating the process.
Yeah, and one thing I will say you have to be careful of when you do that. So I personally get elbow tendonitis because my arms are probably one of my weaker parts. And as a bodybuilder, that's kind of sad, but it just happens to be that way. But when I try to do an arm specialization cycle, I'll get tendonitis after probably like 6 to 8 weeks of extra arm volume. So it's like, all right, well, I know my limit there. Maybe like every third mesocycle, I'll just throw in an arm specialization mesocycle. So that's how I deal with that personally. But I will add too that it's really nice to see a lot of the bigger evidence-based fitness people on the same page, because like I don't have a chance to read and watch everything everyone does, but we're all drawing from the same like scientific literature and somewhat the same experience personally or coaching. And so when you see people saying very similar things, it's really nice that, there's probably evidence to support that versus like, oh, X, Y, or Z does it this way, and you're kind of agreeing with them. It's like, yeah, we all came to the same conclusion. That's awesome.
Yeah, I have a lot of things to say, so hopefully I won't forget any of them. But what I usually do is and that's why I started my podcasting actually, because I just love podcasts, and whenever I do anything that doesn't require my attention, like whenever I fold the laundry or I start prepping a meal or something, I always have something going in the background, and often it's fitness related, often it's not, but it's always something. And I have a couple of people that I like to keep up with, and Mike is one of them, Eric is another one, so I pretty much try to get through anything they create. And as far as arm development, that's honestly not something that I've been worried about for a long time, because my arms aren't anything to brag about, but they are, compared to my body, they are okay, and I just honestly don't really care about them at this point. So like I haven't run probably since I started lifting, because when I started that was essentially what I was doing, like most people I would imagine. But since then, like my chest has been a weakness for a long time before I learned how to properly execute the movements, and then it came up, and now my back, I trained my lats for a long time. They were a key area, and now I'm trying to grow a bit more the upper traps and neck area, kind of get that Bane look, that powerful look. So arms and legs are not something I think I will particularly give attention, but honestly, simply just improving execution. And one of the guys, I don't know how much you follow, if at all, Ben Pakulski's stuff, but honestly, when it comes to execution and muscle growth, he's one of my go-to guys. And one of the guys who works at his gym, Joe Bennett, just posted on Instagram a couple of days ago an image essentially saying how you get big arms. One, pick your parents right, which I guess you don't have anything to do about. Yeah. Second was keep your elbows healthy, and 3 was look at point 1. I think something like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe this helps, maybe not, but what has helped me a lot with not dealing with elbow issues was simply not being attached to particular movements. So I hardly do any of the conventional tricep exercises. Like I don't do skull crushers with barbell, especially the tray barbell. I don't do those overhead dumbbell extensions when you grab the dumbbell with both of your arms. I don't really do barbell close grip presses, although I do. What I like right now, which is one of my favorites, is an incline close grip. By close I mean shoulder width, so kind of like you tuck your elbows, and when they get next to your body, that's your grip width, so not your hands touching each other by any means. So a decent grip width Smith machine press. So essentially a close grip but done on an incline bench, because that's one of my chest movements at the moment. So I need a bit more. You can never have too big of an upper chest. And I honestly prefer the Smith machine for any kind of pressing movements. So that's one movement I do. But other than that, ton of cable work, some dumbbell work, and what I really like to ensure is to have proper alignment. By that I mean that my elbows are pointed up towards the ceiling if I do some sort of a skull crusher movement, and I make sure that I only extend and flex my elbow so there isn't any rotational component. And that's for the bicep exercises too. So for example, if you watch the guys do something like a preacher curl with a barbell, you will almost always see, one, their shoulders moving up and down, and two, you see that rotational component when they grab a barbell, because their elbows aren't perfectly perpendicular to the bench. So essentially they are moving it inside and outside, essentially. So they are rotating it under load, and over time that can be definitely bad for your elbows. So I'm not sure what your exercise selection is or how you perform them, but those two would be some things I would pay attention to. Not doing things that hurt, and making sure you are only extending and flexing through the elbow, not rotating.
I use much the same movements. I don't do skull crushers at all, and any like the overhead dumbbell presses, I don't do those. Most of my stuff is cable work, honestly. Part of it is, it's really hard to increase weight in your arms, so to progressively overload your arms, like I feel like I've been curling the same weight in the dumbbells for like a year now. So because the change is so big relative to how much you're lifting. If you're in a good gym, maybe you have dumbbells that go up by 2.5 pounds or 1 kilo or whatnot. But most of them, it's a significant
2.5.
Yeah. So I agree with you, definitely.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that I was actually looking back through some older videos, and I was using, especially for arms and even for hamstring, even for Romanian deadlifts, I was using weights that right now the ones I'm using are way lighter, and all of my muscle groups are way bigger. So there's something to that.
For sure. I have some of my logbooks back from probably like 7 or 8 years ago, before I got into kind of the scientific side, and it's kind of sad. But you live and you learn. That's part of it, right?
Yeah, and one of the unfortunate things, like I try to, even with this podcast, I try to unite the communities, because I have friends from, like I obviously am friends with a lot of guys in the evidence-based circle, but then I also have a lot of practitioners who are friends with Ben Pakulski, for example, and I just find it sad that, and I agree that Ben has said certain objectively stupid things about nutrition in the past, but that shouldn't be a reason to discount anything and everything that he says or does. Like, I kind of get it, but at the same time, I don't.
Right. Yeah. And I think Greg Knuckles said this at one point when I was talking to him. He was like, you can't really hold stuff to people, anything they've written or posted outside of like 2 years or more, because, people change their minds. Like, as a scientist, I change my mind all the time. Like, there could be a handful of new studies come out and I'm like, oh, well, kind of looks like I was wrong. And everything I wrote back then is also wrong. And yeah, that's okay. I can't tell everyone that read it that, I've now updated my opinion, but maybe if I write another article, do a podcast or something, then, that helps. But you still don't reach everybody. So
yeah, and the funny thing is, do you know who Alex Viada is?
Yes.
Yeah, so Alex has been at Ben's gym a couple of, I guess, months ago now. Like, Alex is apparently preparing for a bodybuilding comp, and Ben wants to do a triathlon, and they are helping each other out. And I asked Alex about it, and he said that, well, for muscle growth, yeah, internal focus and execution is way more important than any of the stuff usually people worry about, like rep range or volume parameters or exercise selection, any of that. Like, it's so weird in a sense that, and the tables are turning right now, but for a long time, like, especially it was in that, 5-7 year period when powerlifting just became so popular, that when Lane started transitioning from bodybuilding to powerlifting and Bryce left bodybuilding, and then just everything started to be about the weights you were lifting, and everyone just threw out the my muscle connection out the window. That doesn't matter, and all that matters is the weights you're lifting, and it's just shifts and trends that kind of people sway into one extreme or the other.
Right. It's hard to get any not attention, but like if you're in the middle on everything, you're not like, oh, so and so thinks this about everything, and that's not really like exciting, right? So I think that's part of it. And it's also people don't put themselves in extreme camps. The people who listen to them or follow them do. Be like, oh, Lane thinks this and this, and he's so extreme. Well, maybe not. Maybe he's not that extreme. Maybe it's just that person's interpretation of what he's seeing. So that's something else to keep in mind.
Even Ben has made a video recently called Progressive Overload is Bullshit. Then I heard him on the podcast and he said, well, I know it pisses people off. That's why exactly I called it that. Because he wanted to attract attention. But if you watch the video or if you listen to the podcast, and I did, he said that of course it matters how much weight you're lifting, but it only matters after you have ensured that you have proper execution and you are putting the tension where you want to put it. So example he was using was a dumbbell fly. So let's say you are using the 10 kilo dumbbells, whatever, and you have only a slight bend in your elbows, and then you go up to the 12 kilo dumbbells, but then you reduce essentially that moment arm, so you essentially form a 90-degree angle with your elbows. So you have reduced the distance between the dumbbell and your shoulders essentially by 50%. So even though you are using heavier dumbbells, the load that you're placing on the muscle is essentially less. So that was his point all along, that if you don't keep execution constant, then you essentially don't deserve and you have no right to use heavier weights. And with that, I agree fully.
Yeah, I actually have some athletes where they buy into the progressive overload a little bit too much, where you can see their form start to break down because they're trying to increase weight. And it's like, well, it might take you a couple mesocycles to increase that lat pull down, a couple kilos. So just focus on your mind muscle connection. You're feeling it in the right places and your form's getting better. Maybe your RPE is dropping a little bit. So there are lots of ways we can kind of quantify and follow improvements.
Oh yeah, like people forget that it should be progressive tension overload, not progressive ego overload. Like I told a guy at the gym a couple of days ago, just because you are putting more plates on the leg press, that doesn't mean that your leg muscles suddenly become scared of the weight and they start growing. That's not how it works. Anyway, just to get back to a bit more of the theoretical concepts, do you think there could be a body part specific effect of periodization? Because I think I've even seen some studies that for the upper body, periodization work more for the lower body. I might be confusing things, but do you think there could be body part specific effect, or if not body part, but at least an exercise specific effect to different periodization strategies?
Yeah, so in my articles for AARR, the meta-analysis that I kind of concluded with showed it very, very slight benefit for maybe linear periodization in the squat and undulating periodization in the bench press. Like, it's not anything that's going to make a huge difference, but I think that probably does exist. Muscle specific, exercise specific types of things, but I don't know if we'll ever have the data to say, that it definitely exists. You know what I mean? Just because of the study kind of design that has to occur, the fact that, it doesn't really, you're talking about maybe 5% max difference. If you say for your quads or your hamstrings, you find the perfect, periodization or perfect rep scheme. I don't know that it matters enough for us to ever figure it out, basically, but it probably does. Something is probably different.
Yeah, that's why I try not to ignore the observations of experienced coaches and practitioners, because if they have seen a particular trend or the same thing repeat over and over again with hundreds of athletes, in the absence of scientific evidence or research-based evidence, we can't discredit that, and I think that's valuable insight. And Mike is again that's why I like his approach, because he's not only he's a scientist, but he's also a practitioner, and he tries to find the best methods that work. And for example, his body part specific frequency recommendations just makes sense. I mean, I find it so astonishing when I see guys use the same volume, but even the frequency for something like calves and then for something like their back or glutes or something. So you have a tiny muscle that barely feels the damage, so to speak, especially if you have a muscle that doesn't go through a whole lot of eccentric damage. So I guess I could do side delts daily, 5 sets, and be fine. Whereas if I try to do that with glutes, for example, with the lunge or something like that, that would be a nasty experience.
Yeah, definitely. I haven't read the specifics yet. I'll have to go back through that in my long list of reading.
With regards to Mike's writings.
Yeah, just to get a better idea.
He has that volume landmarks hub, something like that, and he has written an article, like I think for each muscle group by this point, and like that's so valuable information that he just puts it out for free, even if you don't do it. And I don't think that he would recommend doing it verbatim, but simply if you just give it some thought and you think about it, and even if you apply those concepts to your training, then that could help you out tremendously. By that I don't mean you specifically, just the people in general.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, I agree.
Because the gap between the things I consider, or probably you consider, and the things that a general gym goer would do. Like the other day I trained a girl and she was even astonished when I told her that her workout routine should be based around exercises that target the muscle groups she's trying to work. Like she had an arm day and then a chest day, and I was like, why? Well, is that wrong? Well, it's not wrong. It's just I'm not sure it moves you closer to the goals you have. What do you want? Well, bigger glutes and more toned legs. Well, okay. And I'm sure bicep curls will get you there.
Yeah, there's definitely still a gap between the general population, the evidence-based fitness people that I try to close, because when I teach these classes, like these students they're not exposed to hardly any of the stuff that kind of you and I are exposed to. It's sad, especially if they want to go into some kind of exercise physiology type setting where this would be beneficial. So I'm hoping that we keep getting better and better at it, especially with social media.
Yeah, definitely. And again, like I understand that the stuff we discussed here is kind of minutia. Of course, it's important for us, but in the overall context of an average individual, it's still minutia. And if you try to round up this whole topic of periodization, especially as it relates to bodybuilding, because that's what I'm most interested about, and I would imagine most people who are listening to this would be interested in what would be the practical takeaway when it comes to periodization itself, not necessarily this or that strategy.
Okay, so the take home for periodization is you should probably be doing some type of periodization, because we definitely know that if you stick to a very specific set and rep scheme, that it'll just become monotonous, right? So periodization allows that variation to allow us not to get bored, to focus on specifics, whatever you're training towards. Obviously, you want your training to always be working towards your main goal, and try different strategies, right? So if there's not a difference per se, then you could use all of them or part of them or a few, and that's okay. So I think that would be the kind of take home.
Oh yeah, and one thing that just got reminded of now that you mentioned being bored, and I've seen another study that the guys reviewed in mass, was a recent one that apparently showed a benefit for selecting, so auto-regulating exercise selection essentially. Instead of having the predetermined exercise that you have to do, they selected exercise they wanted to do for a particular muscle group, and apparently that's led to better strength and muscle growth.
Yeah, I actually do that with my athletes, and it's funny because I just set up a block for a physique athlete, and he sends me an email back and he's like, you didn't put any exercises in there. And I was like, well, yeah, but depending on your gym, I'll look at them and your preferences. The research now says, like you mentioned, you can kind of pick what you want to do. So I'll adjust some things, but like I'm just, coaching you via other methods now.
I only train clients at our gym, so I know the equipment they have available, and I usually just give them 2 exercises, especially if someone just wants a training program, then just going to give them usually 2 options, A or B, choose whichever you want. And if then we communicate further and they don't like either of those, well then I'm going to give them a third one, because if they don't like the exercise, they are not going to do it. So that was a great discussion, and we got into more practical things, but I'm sure the listeners won't mind, because ultimately that's much more useful than simply discussing theoretical concepts that they have no use for. So if anyone is interested in checking out the content you put out, maybe your coaching, the work you do with the strength guys, where can they find you? What are your social media accounts?
Okay, so I have a website that I personally built that is not awesome, but it gets the job done, called fitnessandphysiology.com. You can find me on thestrengthguys.com also for coaching. And then I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, pretty much everywhere. Usually some version of brob21, but you can pretty much put it in Google, Brandon Roberts, PhD, muscle, and all of those will come up.
Awesome, and I will link those in the description to make people's job easier. And with that, we have arrived to the final question that we always end our episodes on, and that is simply, what is your definition of success?
I knew this one was coming, not gonna lie, so I might have thought about it a little bit already. So success in it to me is actually constantly failing, but learning from failure, such that you can have more success in science. I think probably like 40% of our experiments turn out as expected. And so we're constantly failing. And, when you hit a success, it's wonderful, but you really have to kind of get happy about it. So I think that's my very weird definition of success, is just constantly failing and learning from it.
No, I think that's a great message actually, and I think if people started enjoying their failures and learning from them, then their lives would be much better. Awesome. Well then, I would like to thank you for this awesome conversation and for giving up your time to do this, and I look forward to chat again in the future.
Okay, well thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care. So that was episode 9 of the Muscle Engineer podcast with Dr. Brandon Roberts. I hope you've liked it and found it helpful. I've linked all of Brandon's social media accounts and where you can get in contact with him for coaching in the description of this episode, where you'll also find links to the meta-analysis we've mentioned, as well as another recent systematic review of periodized versus non-periodized approaches for muscle growth. Now, as far as my own takeaways go, here are my top 3 key reminders. First of all, periodization is a minor component compared to other fundamental considerations for hypertrophy, such as proper execution, selecting specific exercises for your goal, and making sure you're applying overload to your training, meaning it becomes harder in some shape or form over time. The second is that periodization is a concept, not a concrete training plan or program, and as such, there is no right or wrong way of implementing it. Like we discussed in the episode, there is no definitive answer as to which periodization model is best for muscle growth. So try out all of them and see which one you like and respond to best. Third and final point is that periodization becomes more and more important as you become more and more experienced. For a while, you don't need any of it. You can get very good results simply by showing up and putting in some hard work. However, over time the gains will slow down, and that's when fine-tuning your program becomes more and more important. Okay, that sums up my own conclusions. Now, another super cool thing happened this week. Just yesterday, Greg Knuckles released, per his usual style, an absolutely fantastic monster article, which is essentially a meta-analysis of all of the studies ever conducted on periodization in an easy to understand blog format. I'll link that too in the description of the episode, so make sure to read it and let me know what you thought. As always, I want to remind all of you that I don't make any money from the production of these episodes, so if you find them valuable enough that you want to repay me in some manner, you can share it with someone who will enjoy it and find it valuable, and you can leave a review on iTunes or Podbean or wherever you get your podcast from. Any feedback is highly appreciated, so feel free to reach out on any of my social media accounts. Thank you in advance. And that concludes episode 9 of the podcast. Until next week, take care.